Oh, good morning, Bill. Good to see you. And good morning, everyone else. It's about 10:58 right now. So we've got about 2 minutes until we're going to get started with our call with Dr. Kristen Averyt. And she should be on the line shortly joining us. We're going to talk today about the intersection between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. So this should be a really fascinating angle to the crisis that we haven't discussed yet here at the Chamber. So I'm hoping that all of you will have some really good questions. I know that some of you have sent in some questions already that we're going to cover today. And of course, the format of these calls is going to continue as we have been. We'll go ahead and open up with some prepared questions for Dr. Averyt, and from there we'll open it up to any live questions you may have. And so please feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat function in Zoom. That's what it's there for. So please feel free to interact and ask as many questions as you like, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Dr. Averyt, are you on the line yet? Looks like we don't have her quite yet, so we'll just hang tight. It's not quite 11 o'clock yet, so we'll be patient. All right, there she is. Hello, doctor. It looks like you are muted right now. You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Perfect. All right, hello, welcome.
Hi.
All right, so it's right at the top of the hour now, so we'll go ahead and get started. Maybe I'll vamp for a little bit to allow more people to come online in the next minute or two, but we don't want to waste a second with you because we have so many good questions. Once again, for those who are just joining the call, my name is Christine Brown. I'm the Director of Member Engagement at the Reno Sparks Chamber, and this is part of our Path Forward series, a series of calls that we're doing right now to help our members navigate the effects of COVID-19 and allow them the opportunity to hear from those who are shaping policy, from our lawmakers, from influencers in the community who are hard at work in the midst of this pandemic in their areas of expertise. And today's call is going to be undoubtedly fascinating since we're going to navigate, again, that intersection between the environmental impact of COVID-19 and also climate change, and kind of looking to see how those two things are intersecting together and impacting each other. So we've got, again, a great slate of questions, and thank you to our members who continually send in those great questions and ask us those questions. You are invited to ask whatever questions you like live during the call in the chat function. So please just post those there. And at the end of the call, we'll reserve some time to address those questions, and we'll get to as many as possible. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I also do want to thank our partners. We have several partners who have made it their commitment during the COVID-19 crisis to help underwrite our work as we're doing these calls for our members. And so I want to thank Office Depot, I want to thank Eide Bailly, and I want to thank BBSI for their partnership and for, again, underwriting this work that we're doing in order to make it possible to hear from people like Dr. Averyt. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce her. You probably already know who she is, but here's a little bit more about her. Dr. Kristen Averyt serves as the Nevada State Climate Policy Coordinator. She is also a research professor at UNLV and previously served as president of the Desert Research Institute. She holds a PhD from Stanford University and earned a Master's of Science as a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Otago, New Zealand. Dr. Averyt's expertise covers a range of issues, including energy-water nexus, climate and Western water, which we all very much care about, and regional impacts of climate change. She has extensive experience in science policy, including fellowships in the US Senate and at the National Academies of Science. Among her awards and honors, she was one of many scientists who shared in the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was all a mouthful, but just such a beautiful representation of your accomplishments, Doctor.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice.
It's great. It's nice to brag on you. So before we launch into our prepared questions, do you have any comments as we get started?
No, yes, I do. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for hosting this. I really enjoy these dialogues, and I know we're probably all getting a little tired of Zoom meetings, but I found it really great in terms of having these kind of discussions, and it's opening up a broad, just more opportunity for engagement, and I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to point out that I am the first climate coordinator for the state of Nevada, and we are moving forward on climate action in this state in a way that we haven't before. And I'm really looking forward to talking more with all of you about the climate strategy that we're developing, and excited to just tip my cards a little bit on a new state of Nevada climate initiative that we will be launching the end of July, beginning of August.
Fantastic. We will take that first look right here. To open things up, we'll start with a 30,000 foot view and then drill down into some more specific concerns. So would you say the COVID-19 crisis has reinforced concerns over climate change? And if so, how would you say it has done that?
Well, I think there's a lot of similarities, but there's also differences between COVID and climate change. You know, one of the similarities is it is something that is impacting every single person on the planet in some way, shape, or form. And you know, you hear the discussion a little bit about we're all in the same storm, but we're all in very different boats. Some are in yachts and some are in dinghies. And the same holds true for climate change. There are certain people that are going to be more vulnerable, are already more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change compared with other folks. And unfortunately, a lot of the low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous peoples that are being disproportionately impacted by COVID are the same populations that have been identified as being vulnerable to climate change. I think one of the key differences, and this is something I've said quite a bit, is COVID has been a little bit of a knockout punch. I mean, it was like a TKO in the first round, whereas climate change is an ongoing battle. It's like the fight that goes to the end, and it's just more of a death by 1,000 cuts and just lots of little punches, and eventually you just keel over. And I think that's kind of the difference. It's not as acute, it's compounding over time.
Right, and that is a good point, that you know both are urgent, but their expressions are different, and the urgency, you know, our response in urgency should be similar, even though we're perhaps not seeing the effects as acutely. So with that, because the response might look a little different for COVID-19, a lot of folks have had to pivot very abruptly to address the challenges. And with climate change, perhaps the changes have not been so abrupt. Even with those differences, are there any lessons you think we can learn through our COVID-19 response that could help future response to climate change?
Absolutely. I think, it cascades across multiple levels. I think one of the things that's happening right now, the compounding challenges of COVID, as well as what's happening in our communities with respect to racial justice, we're learning right now to have difficult conversations and to challenge one another and our ways of thinking. And I think that there are being able to move forward on those kind of discussions and difficult discussions around climate change, I think we're going to be more prepared to have those challenging conversations, because when it comes to climate, there are no silver bullets. There are going to be trade-offs, and we need to be able to negotiate those and come to understanding one another, and so that way we can address solutions. So I hope just by the discourse and what's happening right now that we're able to learn that. I think the second thing that we can learn is we've got to learn to trust the science and trust the experts. I know we are all armchair experts right now in COVID. I'm like crunching data, and I have no business doing that. I'm going to trust the experts and what they're saying. And similarly, I think trusting science and science literacy is also going to be really important. You know, we're learning a lot. We're seeing science play out in real time right now in terms of, do I wear a mask? Don't I wear a mask? How far do I stand? What do I do? and it's giving we're all getting a little bit of whiplash over it, but that's how science evolves. It's not one study that determines what we need to do. It's over time, it's iteration, and we're seeing that, and it's creating confusion. But at the same time, that's how science works. And so understanding that is not necessarily, that doesn't mean we don't know what we're talking about. It's a process.
Right. And I think to your point, for a lot of folks, and I put myself in that camp, for someone on the outside looking in, you don't always see that process. It's almost like a duck swimming across water. You see science glide across the water as, a calm voice in the storm, and not seeing the paddling that's going on underneath. And right now we're seeing the paddling that's going on underneath. And it can be a little unnerving, but you're right. I think that helps instill confidence that, this back and forth, this dialogue that we're seeing in the scientific community is all part of the process. It's how we arrive at those standards and at those understandings that go down in history, and will most likely change in 100 years. Yes. So moving to the next question, to what extent, we've all seen evidence of this even with the naked eye, like more vivid skylines, cleaner water. To what extent has the pandemic actually served to at least temporarily reverse some of the effects of climate change?
So I'll give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is, okay, let me paint a picture right now. And usually I would do this in a graph, so you're just gonna have to visualize this a little bit. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations a year ago in May were 417 parts per million. It was 415. A year later, it's 417. So it's increased by 2 parts per million. The projections for the end of this year show that the decreases that we've realized in emissions, because people have been staying home, will only decrease our atmospheric concentrations by 0.4 parts per million. So we increased by 2 over a year. The dent that we're going to be putting in terms of how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere is only, less than half a part per million is what we estimate. That's the bad news. And the reason is that we are emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases at a pace that is faster than the natural processes that would otherwise take carbon out of the atmosphere. But the good news is that our daily emissions were down about 17% compared with average during the height of the kind of the shutdown. We expect our annual emissions will be down by about between 4 to 8% by the end of the year. And this really shows that we can, it is pretty dramatic action, everybody locking down and staying home, but I'm optimistic because, this shows that we can reduce emissions. And if we were to take aggressive action to reduce our transportation emissions over time, we can, that 0.4%, we can continue to notch it down and hopefully reduce, at least to some extent, the impacts of climate change on our communities.
Right, absolutely. And I think as a quick follow-up question, I think sometimes we don't have an awareness. I know I would put myself in that camp of what some of the heavy hitters would be when it comes to emissions, in terms of industries, in terms of practices. What would you say are some of the bigger contributions to CO2 emissions in our society?
So it's interesting because maybe 5-10 years ago, the energy sector was the largest emitter of carbon dioxide or of greenhouse gases. But now we've seen a regime change in that transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And that also holds true for Nevada. In our state, it was about the year 2015 where we swapped over to transportation. And a big reason for that is that we have had record retirements of coal-fired power plants across the United States. And a lot of that, some of that was driven by regulation, but a lot of that was just market drivers of natural gas being so inexpensive, and also that the cost of renewables has really dropped dramatically. But we have more people just on the planet in general, and people drive cars and we fly planes. Well, we used to fly around in planes anyway. That's a huge part of our emissions. And jet fuel, that's a greenhouse gas emitter, so that's something to consider. So transportation's a big one. The other one for our state in particular, so transportation is, the biggest piece of the pie, but we are seeing the fastest increase in our emissions from HFCs coming from our air conditioning. And that's going to create a challenge moving forward for reducing our emissions, because we have, again, more people and it's getting hotter. And when it gets hot, we all turn on our air conditioning. I mean, I live in Las Vegas and we're going to be at about 103 degrees today. And I'll tell you, I think my air conditioning is going to be on later today.
Oh, goodness. I'm going to tell you, I am not jealous. I will take my Northern Nevada weather and or fist. So I'm glad we're starting to transition into talking about Nevada specifically, because that's what, my next question really deals with. We know that you alluded to this earlier as well. We know that environmental factors are playing a role in influencing whether or not people could perhaps be susceptible to the kinds of pre-existing conditions that might make them at higher risk for having severe effects from a disease like COVID-19. What are Nevada's most concerning environmental changes or aspects of our environment that could eventually impact public health?
So there are multiple. There is a nexus between air quality and climate, and so tailpipe emissions, for example, are a big source of, it's called PM 2.5, which is basically very tiny particles in the air, as well as ground level ozone. And we have issues with ground level ozone in both Reno and Las Vegas, and particulate matter more so actually in Northern Nevada than we do here in Southern Nevada. And PM 2.5, for example, will go through the roof when we have wildfire events. I mean, when I used to live in Reno, I mean, you remember that everybody knows those
Yes.
days. You're like, oh, there's a fire somewhere, because all that smoke is just sitting right there in the basin, right?
Right.
Well, long-term, there is an abundance of evidence that long-term exposure, and even short-term, but long-term exposure to poor air quality causes problematic issues with respect to vulnerability with certain basically lung disease, asthma, as well as with cardiac issues. So it's your heart and lungs. And with respect to the COVID nexus here with climate change. Now, here, I'm gonna quote a couple specific studies, individual studies. Okay, so this is kind of preliminary because it hasn't gone through that. I loved your analogy about the under the water and where it looks like all through. That's just, I'm so going to use that in the future.
Good.
Yeah, there you go. So there was a study out of Harvard that was all over the media. And what it showed is that for I'm just going to say unit increase in the concentration of fine particles, just 1 unit increase in the air, increased the COVID-19 death rate by 8%. So if you lived in a place where you have higher particulate matter, for every unit that's higher than another place, 8% greater mortality associated with COVID. The second thing that we know, air pollution related diseases are most prevalent among minorities and the marginalized. That's, again, research that we know. And then the third component, and this ties into social justice issues, bringing this all full circle. Based on information, it was reported last Friday for COVID mortalities across the US, for every 100,000 Americans, 62 Black Americans and 36 Indigenous Americans died from COVID-19 for every 100,000. And that's compared to 26 white Americans. Again, that disproportionate impact to communities of color and to low-income communities associated with air quality, and then that linkage with COVID. It all really comes together.
You're right. And that's one of the primary reasons we are having this call today, is to really examine and grapple with that intersection. And it almost feels appropriate to just leave that subject right there, because it is heavy and we don't have the answers yet, and we need to let that heaviness rest with us a little bit. So yes. So let's just absorb that for a moment. So transitioning into the state's climate strategy plan, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about that and how you see that playing into Nevada's economic recovery out of COVID-19.
Right. So in the last legislature, we saw an abundance of activity around climate action. And there were really two key bills that came out of that session. The first was setting really aggressive renewable portfolio standards for the state. And the second was really throwing down the gauntlet in terms of emissions reductions targets that would put us at net zero by 2050. And this was followed up in November of last year. Governor Sisolak issued an executive order that directed the agencies to all collaborate towards putting together a climate strategy for the state. And that's what I have the privilege of coming on board to assist with. The strategy is due on December 1st, and that is a very aggressive timeline considering I started in March. But it's really important to understand that the strategy is just the first step of what is going to be it's the first step in terms of stitching climate into the state of Nevada, in terms of how we think about how we're addressing long-term planning, how we create resilient communities, and also how we just move towards emissions reductions. The strategy the centerpiece is really contemplating what are the different policy options that can help us to achieve the emissions reductions targets that were laid out in SB 254. And that was the bill that was passed in the last legislature. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to use almost a TRL approach, technology readiness levels for those who might not be familiar. And we're going to consider 4 different components of each policy. The first is how far will it get us in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? The second is what we're characterizing as an integrated economic assessment. How much does it cost to implement? How much does it cost to administer, if anything, for the state? And then finally, what's the long-term ROI? And what's from that macroeconomic perspective, what is the benefit? And that includes a societal benefit in terms of would it be lives saved if we're talking about air quality? So that's the second thing. And then the third is really that social justice component. It's how is this going to impact and how will it help low-income communities, communities of color, as well as our indigenous populations across the state? And then finally, it's kind of the political feasibility. Will it take an act of Congress to implement, or is it something that we already have the authority to do on our own? And that's how we're going to contemplate the different policies. I expect a lot of these will have it's really going to be about what information do we and don't we have for these different policies, so that way we can assess what's the risk of implementing something if we don't have particular pieces of information, or hey, we have all the information, and therefore as the decision makers can move forward understanding the ramifications of the policy. We also want to ensure that the strategy is going to create the framework and really lay the groundwork for how we move forward with climate action in the state. So we want to contemplate, for example, what would the governance of climate look like? Would it be an interagency coalition? We've already set that up actually, but would it be, do we need to have a blue ribbon panel? Do we need working groups? What would this look like in terms of how we manage it? And then we also want to really lay the groundwork for resilience planning. And so some of that will be included in there as well. Again, this is just step 1, part A. This is a long, long relationship that we're going to have with climate in this state.
Agreed.
Yeah. Sorry, that's a long answer, but
no, that's totally fine. No, thank you for giving us that long-term and 30,000 foot view in terms of how this strategy is going to be implemented in the different places of the economic sector it will touch. So kind of going from a macro level to a micro level, what would you tell our chamber members on the call who are representing small businesses oftentimes, or perhaps larger businesses in the community who perhaps have a bigger influential footprint? What would you recommend to them in terms of playing an active role, not only toward climate resiliency and recovery, but COVID-19 economic recovery as well?
So I'll start with kind of the broader perspective, which is I 100% believe that clean tech, green jobs, whatever, clean and green is so overused, but it's kind of what we have to describe them, as well as careers and trajectories in environmental stewardship and responsible outdoor recreation. I think all of these we have huge potential to diversify our economy by focusing on, kind of outside the norm and really look at that opportunity. I think, we've done so well in economic diversification in Northern Nevada, and I'm looking forward to realizing more of that in Southern Nevada. And I think it's really encouraging to me that a lot of the small business community, as well as a lot of the companies that were kind of moving into Northern Nevada, really just espouse sustainability and climate resilience. It's kind of a core value. And it's, that's really just encouraging. And it's not just because it's about the triple bottom line, it's because it's the right thing to do. And that change in corporate culture, it's really interesting because we're seeing that at the B schools and the students that are coming through as well. And really just, it's just become an innate part of operating and part of the value proposition that we hear from so many folks. And I think there are opportunities, business models are fundamentally changing right now. And it's been really amazing to me to watch the small business community across our state come together and support one another. And also just all the hashtags. I mean, I've been supporting my local favorite restaurants that are mom and pop shops and making, I think the community is behind it. And I just have loved watching the small businesses pivot on a dime and reinvent their business models to really just make it through. And I think that is just one of the things that is so wonderful about Nevada in general, but our business community. And I think being part of the discussion around climate is very important. For the strategy, we will be having stakeholder engagements, and one of those engagements will be very specifically on the economic diversification and development component and revitalization. I 100% believe that, people talk about climate change and economic development as if they're mutually exclusive. They are not. They can be and have been in great bedfellows. So I really would encourage being part of the discussion. Again, hearkening back to the lessons learned from what we're all going through. We can all come together and have really robust discussions and move forward to identify solutions.
Right. And to your point, the fact that these subjects continue to intersect, public health is something that, in our generation, we haven't seen, at least in the US, a clear example of how public health is directly impacting our economy. And, that has been the case always. And it has always been the case with climate change as well, that intersection is there. And it doesn't do a whole lot of good to treat those subjects as mutually exclusive, but rather to understand that they are directly linked. So thank you. That's a great place to end with our prepared questions that, as business owners, as people who are invested in business, and for the Chamber of Commerce specifically, these are issues that we are committed to and invested in for that very reason. So thank you for all of your comments and all of your insight in regard to the ways that the COVID-19 crisis and the economy and climate change are all intersecting together. So with that, if anyone on the call has any questions for Dr. Averyt, please go ahead and fire those away. We're watching chat right now. I have a couple small things to toss out there. I suppose, and again, you may or may not have answers for these questions, but they're just curiosities that have come to mind. One question is about, the economic pinch that consumers are feeling. It's no secret that sometimes looking toward products that promote a more sustainable lifestyle, at least right now, are a little bit more expensive and hit the pocketbook a little harder. And so, we may have been committed to buying the more expensive but environmentally friendly laundry detergent before, but now it's way more difficult to do that. What do you see long term when it comes to, individual consumers, making those choices between products? And what would you say to a consumer who is trying to decide between a cheaper product and maybe one that's more sustainable? As we're facing, this pinch in our pocketbooks?
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question. This speaks directly to environmental justice as I see it. It's the, if you think globally, for example, I mean, come on, we're the US. We built our backs on coal. And now we're telling developing nations, no, you can't use coal. You've got to use renewables because we are. And I think you can downscale. And I don't think that's necessarily right. If it's going to deny people access to clean water and power, which we know can bring people out of poverty globally. And so I think we can downscale that example and think about, I am in a very fortunate position to be employed right now. And I thank my stars for that, because a lot of my friends have lost their jobs. And so I'm going to make the best decisions I can for the environment, because there are folks right now who can't. And I think that, I mean, that's a reality. When you're concerned about putting food on the table, it is very hard to say, oh, climate change, you should be concerned and pay more. It's like, really? And I completely recognize that reality. I hope over time that those of us that are in the position to be able to make those purchases and drive the markets in those directions, it'll be similar to renewable energy at a macro scale. It's just the market drivers are there. And you know, one of the things that I find really encouraging about the current generation of students that are at our universities and community colleges is, you know, you kind of moved beyond that, and that entitled generation to the generation that are like, well, of course I can change the world and I'm going to do good things. And again, that is part of the value. And it's like, well, of course I'm going to buy that. So I think that I'm optimistic that we will see shifts in terms of that's just the way it is, not that there is even that opportunity or chance. I don't want to say opportunity, but for that, I would say that the more polluting detergent or something along those lines. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It comes down to, if you can, you should. I mean, that's really, you know, if you have the ability to help drive the market in a certain direction, it's our responsibility to do it. So another question, and this is in regard to the CARES Act and other potential legislation that could be coming down the pike at the federal level. You know, there was a lot of discussion, and maybe discussion is a more diplomatic way to put it, but there was a lot of discussion at the federal level when it came to whether or not to embed regulatory constraints on certain industries. Let's use the airline industry as an example, who were going to be receiving federal funds as part of economic recovery, but whether or not to impose stricter EPA standards on industries such as the airline industry. What are your thoughts on embedding those types of regulations into economic recovery legislation? And, you know, if that's the right thing to do at this time?
So I think the broader point that I would make is I would hope that there's as much flexibility for the states to allocate funds that come through any sort of stimulus packages that continue to emerge from Congress, because we all need to be able to do what we can and to deploy those resources. I think that it is, for our state, I think, you know, there's a lot of discussion about infrastructure and investments in infrastructure and shovel-ready projects. And I think we just need to ensure that when we deploy those resources and we make those investments, that we are considering the vulnerabilities and climate, because it's going to cost us a lot more if we have to rip something out or we do it wrong and we don't. And when I say wrong, that in 25 years, you know, we haven't thought about, oh crap, it's going to be a heck of a lot hotter and this particular material won't work, or something. I mean, that's kind of a pedestrian example, but that's the kind of thinking we need to be thinking about. How will this infrastructure be impacted by climate in 35 years? So I think flexibility is important. That said, I think that when it comes to major multinationals and what we're thinking about in terms of how we can achieve emissions reductions nationally through those kind of constraints, I'm not going to say I'm 100% in favor. I'm not going to say that it's a terrible idea either. I think it's worth consideration.
Awesome. I mean, that's all we can do is take it on a case by case basis, and, you know, without, of course, having a crystal ball, that make the best decisions we can for the needs of the moment. So thank you. So I'm not seeing any questions coming in through chat unless anyone sent them to you privately. But I would attribute that to the fact that we're just absorbing all of this great information.
Yeah, sure.
Sometimes the lack of questions is evidence that you've given people a lot of food for thought. So thank you for nourishing us in that way. And with that, we'll probably just go ahead and call it a day. And I thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone on the call who took the time to talk with us today about this. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And if people have questions, you can always send me an email. I'm open to chatting with anybody. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thank you so much. And we will have you on again soon.
Okay, wonderful. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.